There are childhoods marked by comfort and affection, where young souls grow like flowers in a carefully tended garden, sheltered from harsh winds and nourished by love. And then there are childhoods like mine, cold, loveless things, where a child learns early that the world offers no kindness to those born without fortune or favor, where survival itself becomes an act of quiet defiance against those who would rather see you broken than whole. My name is Jane Eyre, and I am telling you my story not because it is extraordinary, though extraordinary things did happen to me, but because it is true, and because in its truth there lies something of value for those who have also known what it means to be unloved, unwanted, and yet determined nonetheless to claim one's rightful place in the world. I was born to parents I never knew, orphaned in infancy and taken in, reluctantly, resentfully, by my mother's brother and his family. My uncle was kind to me, I'm told, though I have no memory of him, for he died when I was very small. His widow, Mrs. Reed, inherited the obligation of my care along with his estate, and she discharged this duty with all the warmth one might show toward an unwelcome burden that propriety forbids one to cast aside entirely. The house was called Gateshead, a handsome property in the north of England, and there I lived with Mrs. Reed and her 3 children, John, Eliza, and Georgiana. They had every comfort, every advantage, while I, though housed and fed, was made to understand in countless small cruelties that I was not truly part of the family, that I existed on sufferance, that gratitude and submission were the only responses permitted to one in my position. My childhood at Gateshead was a study in isolation and injustice. I was excluded from the family circle, forbidden to play with the Reed children as an equal, and blamed for every discord that arose. Young John Reed, a pampered bully of 14, tormented me with impunity, striking me and calling me names while his mother looked on with indifference or, worse still, with approval. I was expected to endure these assaults without complaint, to accept my inferior position with meekness and humility. But I was not meek. I was not humble. And on one particular day, when John struck me with unusual violence, I found within myself a fury I had not known I possessed. I fought back, struck him in return, called him cruel and tyrannical, gave voice to all the rage and injustice I had been forced to swallow for years. The household erupted in scandal. I, the poor dependent, had dared to raise my hand against the young master. It was unthinkable, unforgivable. Mrs. Reed had me locked in the Red Room, the chamber where my uncle had died, a place of shadows and silence that all the household avoided. I was thrust into that darkness as punishment, told to reflect upon my wickedness and ingratitude. But it was there, in that room of death and memory, that I felt for the first time the presence of something like justice. My uncle, were he living still, would not have permitted such treatment. He had loved me, I was told, had made his wife promise to care for me as her own. The terror of that night, the shadows that seemed to move, the sense of supernatural presence, my own screams echoing off the walls until I fainted from fear, marked a turning point. Mrs. Reed, embarrassed by the incident and eager to be rid of me, seized upon it as justification for sending me away. I would be dispatched to Lowood, a charity school for orphan girls, where I would be educated and trained for employment as a governess. Mrs. Reed presented this as generosity, but I understood it for what it was: exile. Lowood Institution was a place of cold stone and colder charity where some 80 girls lived in conditions of systematic deprivation justified by religious doctrine. We were fed poorly, clothed inadequately, and subjected to a regime designed to break our spirits and mold us into grateful, submissive women who would accept without question whatever limited station life offered us. The superintendent, Mr. Brocklehurst, was a tall, grim man who preached humility and self-denial while his own wife and daughters dressed in silk and velvet. He declared that adversity was good for our souls, that comfort corrupted, and that the purpose of our education was to teach us to endure hardship with Christian resignation. He inspected us like livestock, criticized our appearance, and once ordered a girl's naturally curly hair to be cut off because he deemed it a vanity unsuited to charity pupils. Yet even in that harsh environment, I found something Gateshead had never offered: friendship. Helen Burns was a girl of extraordinary patience and goodness, who bore every punishment and hardship with serene acceptance, who spoke of forgiveness and heavenly reward, who tried to teach me that hatred and resentment only poisoned the one who harbored them. We would talk in whispers after lights were put out, and she would share with me her vision of a world beyond this one, where justice finally prevailed and suffering was redeemed. Miss Temple, the superintendent's assistant, was another source of kindness in that bleak place. She was young, gentle, and genuinely concerned for our welfare, though she had to work within the constraints of Mr. Brocklehurst's oppressive system. She defended us when she could, supplemented our meager rations with her own provisions, and treated us with a respect that seemed revolutionary in that context. But Lowood was a place where illness thrived as surely as kindness struggled. That first spring, typhus swept through the school, claiming victim after victim among the weakened, malnourished girls. Helen Burns, already suffering from consumption, contracted the fever and declined rapidly. I visited her in the sick room one last time, climbing into her narrow bed to hold her as she died, this gentle soul who had taught me something of forgiveness, though I would never quite master her serene acceptance of injustice. The typhus epidemic brought public attention to Lowood's conditions, and reforms followed. Mr. Brocklehurst's power was curtailed, better food and housing were provided, and the school became a more humane place. I remained there for 8 years, 6 as a student, 2 as a teacher, growing from a passionate, rebellious child into a young woman of education and independence. But at 18, I felt the stirring of a restlessness I could not name. The safe, predictable world of Lowood had become confining. I yearned for experience, for liberty, for something beyond the narrow horizons of a charity school. And so I placed an advertisement seeking a position as governess, and received a reply from a Mrs. Fairfax at Thornfield Hall, requiring someone to instruct a young French girl in English. Thornfield was a gentleman's manor house in the north, a place of gray stone and ancient history, presided over by Mrs. Fairfax, a kindly elderly widow who served as housekeeper. My pupil was Adel Varence, a lively child of 8 or 9, ward of the master of the house, Mr. Rochester, who was often away on business and whom I did not expect to meet for some time. The house itself was a study in Gothic atmosphere, vast, old, with mysterious locked rooms and a strange laugh that sometimes echoed through the upper floors, which Mrs. Fairfax attributed to Grace Poole, a servant. I found the place both unsettling and fascinating, and my life there quickly settled into a comfortable routine of lessons with Adel and pleasant conversations with Mrs. Fairfax. It was on a January twilight, while walking to the village to post a letter, that I first encountered Edward Rochester. A horse and rider came galloping down the icy lane, and the horse slipped and fell. I assisted the rider, a dark-browed man of perhaps 35, stern-faced and abrupt in manner. He accepted my help with little grace, mounted his horse, and rode on. Only when I returned to Thornfield and saw the same horse in the stable did I realize I had met the master himself. Rochester was unlike anyone I had encountered, a man of powerful presence and mercurial moods, by turns harsh and kind, sardonic and sincere. He was not handsome in the conventional sense, but there was something compelling about him, a vitality and intensity that drew the eye and commanded attention. He took an immediate and unusual interest in me, summoning me to his presence in the evenings, engaging me in conversations that ranged far beyond the usual exchanges between master and governess. He questioned me about my thoughts, my experiences, my opinions. He challenged my statements, provoked my responses, and seemed to find entertainment in my straightforward manner and refusal to flatter or dissemble. I was plain, poor, and obscure, all things I acknowledged freely, but I refused to be servile or self-effacing. I met him as an equal in conversation, if not in station, and this seemed to please him, though he often pretended otherwise. "You are not beautiful," he told me once with characteristic bluntness. "Do you consider yourself so?" "No, sir," I replied honestly. "And you are aware that you are plain, disconnected, and little?" "I have never flattered myself otherwise." "You have noticed my dissimilar manner toward you?" "I observe it, but I cannot always fathom its meaning, sir." These exchanges, strange as they might seem, formed the basis of a connection that grew deeper with each passing week. Rochester was haunted by something, some secret sorrow or hidden guilt that occasionally surfaced in bitter remarks about his past. He spoke of mistakes made, of paths chosen that could not be retraced, of being not a villain, yet having done things he regretted. Strange events continued at Thornfield. One night I woke to find smoke seeping under my door and discovered Rochester's bed curtains ablaze, with him unconscious within. I woke him, and together we extinguished the fire. He attributed the incident to Grace Poole, that mysterious servant whose laugh I had heard, but his explanation seemed insufficient, and he swore me to secrecy about the matter. Rochester left Thornfield for several weeks, and I discovered in his absence how much his presence had come to mean to me. The house felt empty without him, and I found myself listening for his step, watching for his return. When he finally came back, he brought a party of fashionable guests, including the beautiful Blanche Ingram, whom everyone assumed he would marry. I was forced to witness their interactions, her calculated charm, his apparent interest, the general expectation that an engagement would soon be announced. I told myself that I had no right to feel the pain that gripped my heart, that I had been foolish to imagine any significance in our conversations, that a governess and her employer existed in different worlds that might touch but never truly connect. Yet even as I struggled with these emotions, Rochester continued to seek my company, to draw me into conversations, to look at me with an intensity that contradicted his supposed courtship of Miss Ingram. And then, one evening, he called me to him and, in a manner both cruel and tender, told me he was to be married and that I must leave Thornfield, must find another position far away. The pain of this was unbearable, and I could not hide my distress. And it was then, seeing my anguish, that Rochester revealed the truth: there would be no marriage to Blanche Ingram. It was I he loved, I he wished to marry, despite all the inequalities of station and fortune that made such a union seem impossible. "Do you think I am an automaton?" I cried, "a machine without feelings? Do you think, because I am poor, obscure, plain, and little, that I am soulless and heartless? You think wrong. I have as much soul as you, and full as much heart. And if God had gifted me with some beauty and much wealth, I should have made it as hard for you to leave me as it is now for me to leave you." Rochester proposed marriage, and despite my shock and my awareness of how unconventional such a match would be, I accepted. I loved him, had loved him, almost from our first meeting, and his declaration that he loved me in return, that he saw in me an equal despite all outward circumstances, fulfilled a longing I had carried all my life: to be valued, to be chosen, to be loved. The preparations for our wedding proceeded, though I felt a growing sense of unease that I could not explain. Rochester was impatient to marry quickly, to have the ceremony done and carry me away to the continent. Strange events continued. My wedding veil was torn in two by some intruder in the night, though Rochester again attributed it to Grace Poole. There was something he was not telling me, some shadow that hung over our happiness. The wedding day arrived, and we proceeded to the church where the ceremony began. But at the crucial moment, when the clergyman asked if anyone knew of any impediment to the marriage, a voice rang out, "The marriage cannot go on." I declare the existence of an impediment. A lawyer stepped forward with a shocking revelation. Edward Rochester was already married. His wife, Bertha Mason, was living still, confined in the upper floors of Thornfield Hall. The mysterious laugh, the fire, the torn veil, all were the work not of Grace Poole, but of a madwoman, Rochester's wife, kept locked away for years while he attempted to live as though she did not exist. Rochester did not deny it. Instead, he brought us all back to Thornfield, and, in a scene of Gothic horror, showed us his wife, a violent, deranged woman who bore no resemblance to a human being in her right mind, who snarled and attacked, who had to be restrained by Grace Poole, her keeper. He told us of his youth, of how he had been tricked into marrying her in Jamaica, how her madness had manifested after the wedding, how he had brought her back to England and concealed her, unable to divorce her, but equally unable to live as her husband. He pleaded with me to understand, to remain with him despite the impossibility of legal marriage, to live with him as his wife in all but name. He spoke of his loneliness, his suffering, his years of searching for true connection and finding it at last with me. He declared that God had brought us together, that the laws of men should not separate what nature and affection had joined. I loved him still, even in that moment of betrayal and revelation. But I could not do as he asked. To remain as his mistress would be to violate my own principles, to surrender the self-respect that had sustained me through all hardships. I had been unloved as a child, but I had never been without integrity. I could not now purchase happiness at the cost of my own soul. And so, in the darkest hour before dawn, I fled Thornfield. I left with nothing but a few coins in my pocket, no destination in mind, only the desperate need to escape before my resolution failed, and I agreed to stay. I took a coach as far as my money would carry me, then walked until exhaustion overcame me, collapsing at last on the doorstep of a house where, by providential chance, I was taken in and saved from death by exposure. The house was called Moore House, and its inhabitants were two sisters, Diana and Mary Rivers, and their brother, St. John, a clergyman. They nursed me back to health, and I concealed my true identity, calling myself Jane Eyre and claiming to be without family or connections. I found work as a schoolmistress in the village, teaching poor children, living simply and trying to rebuild my shattered life. St. John Rivers was a man of extraordinary dedication to duty, cold in manner but burning with ambition to serve God through missionary work in India. He was handsome as a classical statue and just as cold, all passion sublimated into religious fervor. He proposed that I should marry him and accompany him to India as a missionary's wife, not from love, but from a calculated assessment that I would be useful to his work. I recognized this proposal for what it was, another kind of prison, different from but no less confining than the one Rochester had offered. St. John would value me only for my utility, would crush all feeling and individuality in service to his religious mission, would work me to death in a climate unsuited to my constitution, all while offering me a loveless marriage that would be legal but empty. It was then, as I struggled with St. John's insistent demands that I accept his proposal, that I heard, or seemed to hear, Rochester's voice calling my name across the miles that separated us. Jane. 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 The call was so clear, so urgent, that I knew something had happened, that he needed me, that I must return to discover his fate. I made my way back to Thornfield, my heart pounding with hope and dread, only to find the house a blackened ruin. The fire that had been threatened so many times had finally come, set by the madwoman Bertha, who had also perished in the flames. Rochester had tried to save everyone, had ensured all the servants escaped, had attempted to rescue his wife, but the roof had collapsed, and though he survived, he had been gravely injured, blinded and maimed, left helpless and despairing in a lonely manor house some miles away. I found him there, my Rochester, broken in body but not in spirit, believing himself abandoned by all, convinced that I must have married St. John Rivers or found someone else to love. The joy of our reunion was beyond words. I assured him that I loved him still, that I had never stopped loving him, that I would marry him now if he would have me. He protested that he was ruined, that he could offer me nothing, that I deserved better than a blind, maimed man who could not provide for me properly. But I had recently inherited a fortune from an uncle I had never known, the same uncle, ironically, from whom St. John Rivers and his sisters were descended, making them my cousins. I was now independent, possessed of means, and could choose to marry where my heart led rather than where necessity dictated. I love you, I told him simply. I have loved you almost from our first meeting, and I will love you until my last breath. Your injuries do not diminish you in my eyes. I want to be your companion, your nurse, your wife, not from duty or pity, but from the purest affection and the deepest conviction that we belong together. We married quietly, with no family or friends present, just ourselves and the clergyman and the church clerk as witness. It was everything our first attempted wedding had not been: simple, honest, untainted by deception or hidden impediments. I became his wife in truth, and we began our life together in that quiet house, away from society and its judgments. I was his eyes, his hands, his companion in all things. I read to him, walked with him, shared every thought and feeling without reserve. We were equals at last, not in physical capacity perhaps, but in every way that truly mattered. He needed me, and I needed him, and together we formed a partnership of genuine mutual regard and deep affection. Time brought healing, partial, but significant. Rochester's sight gradually returned in one eye, enough that he could see our first child when it was born, could look upon my face once more. We lived quietly and contentedly, finding in each other all the happiness that years of suffering had seemed to place forever beyond our reach. I maintained my connections with Diana and Mary Rivers, who married well and happily. St. John went to India as planned and worked himself to exhaustion in service to his calling, writing occasionally with news of his labors and his approaching end, which he faced with grim satisfaction as the culmination of his life's purpose. I respected his dedication while being grateful that I had not shared his fate. My story is not a fairy tale, though it ends in happiness. I was not rescued by wealth or beauty or good fortune. I survived and ultimately thrived through my own determination, through refusal to compromise my integrity even when doing so might have brought easier happiness, through insistence on being valued for who I was rather than accepting the diminished roles that others, Mrs. Reed, Mr. Brocklehurst, St. John Rivers, would have assigned to me. I was poor, plain, obscure, all things the world tells us make a person of no account. But I possessed something that wealth and beauty cannot purchase: self-respect, integrity, and the courage to insist that these qualities make me the equal of anyone, regardless of station. I would not accept love on terms that required me to surrender my own soul. I would not marry without genuine affection and mutual respect. I would not live as less than what I was, a thinking, feeling being deserving of dignity and consideration. Rochester learned to value these qualities in me, learned that true partnership requires equality of spirit even when circumstances create inequality of other kinds. His injuries humbled him, brought him to a place where he could receive as well as give, where he needed as well as commanded, and in that humility he found the capacity for the kind of love that transcends circumstances, a love based not on what one can provide, but on who one is. The world tells poor women, plain women, obscure women, that they should be grateful for whatever scraps of affection or security might come their way, that they should not aspire to happiness or fulfillment, that their proper role is submission and self-abnegation. I rejected those teachings. I insisted on my right to be loved for myself, to be valued as an equal, to make choices based on principle rather than necessity. This did not make my path easier. Indeed, it made it far more difficult. I suffered loneliness, hardship, heartbreak, and near death. But I emerged with my integrity intact, with my sense of self uncompromised, and ultimately with a happiness more genuine and lasting than any I might have obtained through surrender or compromise. There are those who will say I was fortunate, that the inheritance from my uncle solved my problems, that Rochester's injuries leveled the imbalance between us. Perhaps, but fortune favors the brave, and I would not have been in a position to receive these blessings had I not first chosen the difficult path of principle over the easy path of compromise. I think of that child locked in the Red Room at Gateshead, terrified and alone, convinced of her own worthlessness because everyone around her said it was so. I wish I could tell her that she would survive, that she would find people who valued her, that she would eventually discover love and happiness and a place where she truly belonged. But perhaps she already knew it somehow, in the fierce determination that would not let her accept the role of inferior, in the passion that insisted she had as much right to happiness as anyone, in the courage that would eventually bring her through darkness into light. As I sit here now, my husband beside me, our children playing nearby, I reflect on the strange journey that brought me to this place of peace and contentment. From Gateshead to Lowood, from Thornfield to Morehouse and back again, each place taught me something, shaped me in ways I could not have predicted, prepared me for the choices I would have to make and the principles I would have to defend. I learned at Gateshead that the world can be cruel to those without power or position, but that accepting cruelty as one's due only perpetuates it. I learned at Lowood that kindness exists even in harsh circumstances, that friendship can sustain us through the darkest times, and that death is not the worst thing that can happen. Losing one's integrity is far worse. I learned at Thornfield what it means to love and be loved, but also that love alone is not enough if it requires the sacrifice of one's principles. And I learned at Morehouse that independence has value beyond mere survival, that work and purpose can heal a broken heart, and that family can be found in unexpected places. These lessons formed me, made me who I am. I am Jane Eyre Rochester now, wife and mother, comfortable and content. But I am still that fierce child who would not submit, that young woman who walked away from the man she loved rather than compromise her soul, that teacher who found dignity in humble work, that wanderer who survived by determination when fortune had abandoned her. We are all formed by our experiences, shaped by the choices we make when circumstances test us. Some people break under pressure, surrender their principles for comfort or security, accept diminished roles because the alternative seems too difficult. Others, like myself, refuse to break, insist on their worth regardless of what the world tells them, and ultimately find that this very refusal creates the possibility for genuine happiness. The fire burns low in the grate, and evening settles over the house. Rochester calls for me. He still prefers my company to any other, and I close this book of memory, this account of a life lived according to principle, even when principle demanded terrible sacrifice. My story is told, my journey complete from lonely child to beloved wife, from powerless dependent to independent woman who chose her own fate. I would not change it, would not smooth away the difficulties or bypass the hardships. They made me who I am, taught me what I needed to know, brought me eventually to this place of peace. The child in the red room could not have imagined this future, but she possessed within herself everything necessary to reach it: courage, integrity, determination, and an unshakable conviction that she deserved to be loved for who she was. That conviction sustained me through all trials and brought me at last to genuine happiness, not the false happiness of compromise or surrender, but the real happiness that comes from being fully oneself, fully valued, fully loved. This is what I wish for every girl who feels unloved and unwanted, every woman who is told she should accept less than she deserves. Trust yourself, maintain your integrity, and never accept love on terms that require you to be less than you are. The world may say you are poor, plain, obscure, of no account. But you have as much soul as anyone, as much heart, as much right to happiness and fulfillment. Insist on it, fight for it, never surrender it. And you may find, as I did, that the very qualities the world dismisses are the ones that ultimately matter most: honesty, courage, integrity, and the determination to live according to principle even when doing so costs everything. Thus ends my tale, the story of Jane Eyre, who began with nothing and gained everything that truly matters, who refused to be broken by hardship or diminished by circumstance, who insisted on her own worth when no one else would recognize it, and who found at last the love and belonging that every human soul deserves. The night is peaceful, the house is warm, and I am content. What more could any life require?